My boy Jeffrey Nippard just released a shoulder exercise tier list, and I've had a ton of you guys ask me to react to this. And because I'm here to make fitness great again, I'll be going over Jeffrey Nippard's shoulder exercise tier list and letting you know what my thoughts are. Before I get into the shoulder exercises, if you're looking to build an aesthetic physique or reach peak athlete athleticism, be sure to check out my 90-day aesthetic body blueprint or my 120-day peak athleticism package. But if you're someone who thinks they'd benefit more from one-on-one coaching, I just started doing one-on-one coaching. All of these will be in the description.
The standing dumbbell lateral raise. I like the dumbbell lateral raise because it's super simple and you can get them done quickly. You can grab a pair of dumbbells a lot faster than you can set up a cable, especially if you do cables one arm at a time. So I do think they are the most time-efficient shoulder exercise, but I don't think they're the most effective shoulder exercise. That's because you have zero tension on your side delts at the bottom when they're the most stretched, and you don't reach peak tension until your arms are at 90 degrees when the delts are most shortened. But despite this limitation, they'll still clearly grow your shoulders. This has been proven by real-world examples of bodybuilders who've built huge side delts from dumbbell laterals. And I still do these myself whenever I'm pressed for time. But because of the slightly suboptimal tension curve, I'm putting these in B tier.
Damn, Jeffrey decided to go with the buzz cut. Kind of reminds me of my boy Mikhaila Mudryk. Anyways, going on to the lateral raises, B tier isn't bad, but his logic is freaking stupid. Jeffrey doesn't seem to understand that the prime mover at the beginning of abduction aren't the deltoids, but it's actually the supraspinatus. And that the deltoids are actually the prime mover of abduction at around 15 to 90 degrees. So he's being very dramatic that there's not much tension at the beginning of abduction with dumbbell lateral raises, as if your goal is pure deltoid activation, which I would assume that's the goal if you're doing a shoulder exercise tier list, it's not that big of a deal. Lateral raises are so important for aesthetics, as not only are the front delts typically overdeveloped in most people, but the side delts help give you a broader appearance, which is more aesthetic. Again, although the tension isn't the greatest at the beginning of the range of motion, the deltoids become the prime mover of shoulder abduction at around 15 degrees, so I'm not too concerned about this. And if I do want more tension at the beginning of the range of motion, I'll go with cable lateral raises instead. Dumbbell lateral raises aren't quite S tier for me, but it's an amazing exercise that everyone should include in their lifting routine.
If you lean against something, like a bench or a rack, you suddenly modify the resistance curve to place more tension on your side delt when it's most stretched. I think that this is the most effective way to do lateral raises with dumbbells. The lean-in dumbbell lateral raise is going in A tier.
Lean-in lateral raises, Jeffrey's being pretty dramatic about this. In my opinion, leaning in won't make much of a difference as compared to a standard dumbbell lateral raise. And as we all know, this nerd Jeffrey Nippard overrates the fuck out of the stretch position for hypertrophy. My issue with this exercise is I don't really like how you have to brace against an object to do it, but I feel like this exercise can be incorporated into your routine occasionally if you're looking to hit the side delts differently. But in my opinion, if you're so concerned about the resistance profile of standard dumbbell lateral raises, you should just use cables instead of doing this exercise. I'll put this exercise in B tier just because it can be pretty useful for people who don't have access to cables.
Leaning away might shift some emphasis away from the muscles of the rotator cuff and onto the lateral delt, depending on how you interpret this study, but it still has the issue of not placing high enough tension in the stretched position. So I'm putting these in B tier as well.
Lean away dumbbell lateral raises. I think leaning away makes more sense with cables, especially when the cables are positioned at the very bottom. But for dumbbells, I don't see why this would be very effective. I mean, these lateral raises are essentially just the worst version of standard dumbbell lateral raises. I really don't see the purpose of this exercise, so I'll have to put it in D tier.
The Super ROM lateral raise. I picked these up from Dr. Mike Israetel when we trained shoulders together, and man, they definitely lit my delts up. I think this is a very rare movement where you actually get the side delt fully contracted. I like that. And even though the trend of the current evidence is converging on the stretch being more important than the squeeze, there's actually very little direct evidence on the shoulders about this. So I think these are worth trying. That said, because they have the same resistance curve issues as the standard dumbbell lateral raise, they're not quite good enough to get into A tier. I'm putting the Super ROM lateral raise in B tier.
Super range of motion lateral raises. This exercise has to be so stupid, and it doesn't surprise me that Dr. Marlon Israetel is the one that made up this exercise. For mobility, sure, I guess this exercise is okay, but for hitting the lateral delts in particular, this exercise is so stupid and so unnecessary. For being nerds, Jeffrey Nippard and Marlon are so freaking stupid because they don't seem to understand the anatomy of the lateral delts. As I mentioned earlier, the delts are the primary mover of shoulder abduction from about 15 to 90 degrees. Once you go past 90 degrees, the prime mover of shoulder abduction goes from the deltoids to the serratus and the traps. So doing super range of motion lateral raises are essentially just a worse version of standard lateral raises because you have to use far less weight and you don't keep constant tension on the lateral delts. I'm between D and F tier for this exercise in terms of hypertrophy, but I'll put it in D tier.
People who like the overhead press really like the overhead press. The question is, how effective is the exercise for building 3D delts? Well, Let's see. It does provide high tension on the shoulders in the stretched position. You can overload it extremely well. Even though the lift tends to be a stubborn lift, you can usually add a little weight or a rep, or at least improve your technique in some way. And I think that once you nail the technique down, it's a very gratifying lift. So that's all awesome. However, it does have two downsides. For one, it's very anterior delt dominant. When we look at activation patterns across the delt heads, you see that the side and rear heads aren't activated much with the overhead press. And for two, because you're standing, it's not the most stable. This means your lower body and your core will have to work to keep your balance, which will shift some tension coming from the bar away from your shoulders. That's not a deal breaker, but it's probably not ideal from a bodybuilding standpoint. So all things considered, I think I like the barbell overhead press more than a lot of science-based hypertrophy heads, but I think I like it less than some power building purists. I'm putting it in B tier plus.
Overhead press B tier for Jeffrey. I don't think that's a bad choice, but his logic is so freaking stupid. Jeffrey states that the main con of this exercise is that it's anterior delt dominant and that it's pretty unstable. When it comes to the overhead press being anterior delt dominant, this is such a stupid complaint. This is like complaining that lat pull downs are too lat dominant. While it is true that most people have overdeveloped front delts, this is because people add in exercises like front raises to pressing movements like bench press variations and the overhead press. If you only bench press, I highly doubt that your front raises will be developed very well, which is why incorporating overhead pressing is very beneficial. And when it comes to Jeffrey complaining about the stability of this exercise like all these other soy boys do, instability is not necessarily a bad thing, and I'd argue it's a very good thing. The instability of the overhead press will help develop shoulder stability and core strength, and unlike significantly unstable exercises like Bosu ball exercises, it's not too unstable where it severely impacts hypertrophy and strength development. Because the overhead press is the only shoulder exercise as a foundational human movement, with it being a vertical push, this exercise has to be S tier for me.
Do them seated, you do fix the stability issue since you no longer have to worry about your balance. But since they're still very front delt dominant, and there's something about the seated OHP that just isn't as satisfying as the standing OHP, I'm gonna leave these in B tier as well.
Of course, the soy boy Jeffrey is, he thinks sitting down makes an exercise better all of a sudden. In my opinion, the seated overhead press is just a slightly worse version of the standing overhead press. But if you're doing a free weight seated overhead press, at least you're working on shoulder stability, so I don't have too much beef with this exercise. I would generously put this exercise in B tier.
If you switch the barbell out for dumbbells, I think a few things improve. For one, you can get your sets done faster. You can grab a pair of dumbbells a lot faster than you can set up a barbell. For two, you can get a bit more range of motion at both the bottom and at the top, especially if you allow the dumbbells to converge. And three, I think you'll get a little more side delt involvement with dumbbells because they have to activate to keep the dumbbells from falling forward or backward. And so I'm gonna put these in A tier.
Dumbbell overhead press, I wouldn't necessarily say it's better or worse than the barbell variation because there's pros and cons with using both dumbbells and barbells. I think you should include both the dumbbell overhead press and barbell overhead press in your routine, so I'll put this exercise in S tier as well.
The machine shoulder press is a personal favorite. If you can find a good machine that gets your delts into a deep stretch, I do find that it feels better than dumbbells, and also, since it's less dependent on technique and coordination, you can get your delts all the way to failure without losing control of the weight. It's still going to be very front delt dominant, but as a vertical pressing option for hypertrophy, this is usually my go-to these days. It's going in A tier plus.
What a soy boy take! So apparently when it comes to the machine overhead press, apparently the exercise being anterior delt dominant isn't a problem anymore. The machine overhead press is just a worse version of its free weight counterpart. As due to the fixed range of motion, there's no shoulder stability required, which leads to less real world strength and a higher chance of a shoulder injury outside the gym. And it's also done seated, so there's no core engagement. I'm gonna put the machine shoulder press in C tier. I'm putting this exercise in C tier because if you're doing a free weight overhead press, this exercise could have a place in your routine, especially if you're hitting a plateau in that exercise.
All right, this is a cool exercise you may have seen recently on Arnold's Instagram. I'll call it the Arnold style side-lying dumbbell raise. It looks a bit odd, but I actually really like it. Unlike a standing dumbbell lateral raise, you get high tension while your delt is stretched, and because you're locked in against a bench, you'll be nice and stable. You'll get a huge range of motion, and you should get a great side delt pump here. I'm putting these in A tier.
A tier for this exercise is just ridiculous. Again, Jeffrey has a weird stretch fetish, so of course he's gonna overrate this exercise. The reason why I'm not a big fan of this exercise is because it looks incredibly awkward, and if I really want tension at the stretch position, I'm just gonna go with cables instead.
For the record, front raises of any kind, so dumbbell, cable, or machine, are all going in D tier. I think that if you have any pressing in your program, your front delts are already getting more than enough work so they don't need any extra isolation.
I actually agree with Jeffrey spot on here. The reason why I don't like front raises is because it's usually overkill for most people. Because most people are bench pressing, incline bench pressing, and doing some sort of overhead press to where isolating the front delts isn't necessary, and it's better to focus your attention on developing the lateral delts or the rear delts. So I'll put this exercise in D tier as well.
The Atlantis standing machine lateral raise is amazing because it feels so smooth and you get this even, consistent tension on the side delts throughout the range of motion. It's easy to add a little weight or a rep from week to week, and since I've been using it, I've actually gotten so much stronger with it that I'm getting pretty close to maxing out the weight stack. The only minor snag is that since you can't move your arms across your body, you won't get quite as good of a stretch as you will with cables or even with the Arnold lying raise. So it's very close to S tier, but I'm gonna tentatively knock it back to A tier plus.
Machine lateral raises A tier for Jeffrey. I think that's a little bit too high. The good thing about this exercise is that you do get good tension at the bottom of the movement, but I really don't like how the range of motion is fixed, so I don't work on shoulder stability. However, I can see this exercise being included in your routine occasionally just to hit the lateral delts differently. This exercise is not quite on the level of free weight lateral raises in my opinion, so I'll put it in C tier.
The seated machine lateral raise is similar, and I include it as well. But for whatever reason, having the pads higher up on my arms doesn't feel quite as good. That might be because the moment arm to the shoulder is so short that I have to load it with more weight, and that actually cranks my shoulders a bit. I still like these, but I think they're in between A tier and B tier. I'll be picky and say B tier.
Seated machine lateral raise, I'm not a big fan of this exercise. Just like the other lateral raise machine, I don't like how the range of motion is fixed. In my opinion, this machine is slightly worse because I've used it a couple times and I've really found it pretty awkward. And even though this machine is meant to isolate the lateral delts, I really don't feel it when I've used this machine. Since I find this exercise slightly worse than the other lateral raise machine, I'll have to put this exercise in D tier.
The cable lateral raise is incredible because as long as you set the cable at around hand height, it'll provide maximum tension on the side delt while it's most stretched. That's because you get the highest tension whenever your arm and the cable form a 90-degree angle. Perhaps more importantly though, I find a cable lateral raise just feels excellent. You get that nice, even tension on your side delts throughout the range of motion. I personally find I can connect with my side delts even better if I use wrist cuffs. That's because even though my grip won't be a limiting factor here, my forearms still get a big pump, and that takes away some of my focus from my delts. But then if I just have a floating hand with nothing to hold on to, it feels a bit awkward. So I hold on to a lacrosse ball with the cuff. This might be too gimmicky for some of you, but I love them. You really can't go wrong with a cable lateral raise, whether you do them with a standard D handle or with cuffs, and that's why they're going straight to S tier.
Cable lateral raise, S tier for Jeffrey, not a bad choice. Cuff lateral raises are freaking stupid, and that was a soy boy take from Jeffrey, but I do think this exercise is amazing. Although cable lateral raises are a little bit more stable than dumbbell lateral raises, the resistance profile of this exercise is great, and it differs enough from dumbbell lateral raises to where I think both of these exercises should be in your routine. I wouldn't necessarily say it's better or worse than dumbbell lateral raises, so I'll put it in S tier as well.
Cable Y raise actually gives you an even bigger range of motion where you sweep the cable up and out and back. And it's also going in S tier.
Cable Y raise A tier, I think that's pretty overrated. Again, going past 90 degrees of abduction is pretty useless for deltoid development, but if you're stopping at around 90 degrees, I can definitely see this exercise being pretty beneficial as you're hitting the lateral delts a little bit differently from standard cable lateral raises. I'm gonna put this exercise in B tier.
The behind the back cuffed lateral raise is the most gimmicky looking exercise that I actually do, but I think it's amazing. Its main advantage over the standard cable lateral raise is that you get to knock out both arms at once, which is twice as time efficient. To set it up, just hook your wrists into the cuffs, optionally grab a pair of lacrosse balls, and step over one of the cables while spinning around and crossing the cables over behind your back. Then step forward and raise the cables out and slightly forward. Who cares what it looks like? If it works, it works. These are going in S tier.
No way this dude put this in S tier. In my opinion, this exercise is way too gimmicky, and using freaking cuffs is so lazy. Although I don't see this exercise being better than cable lateral raises, if you do use handles, this could be an interesting way to hit your lateral delts, and I can see this exercise having a place in your routine. I'm gonna put this exercise in B tier as well.
Banded lateral raise is my least favorite lateral raise option, and I rarely include it these days. Similar to the dumbbell lateral raise, it provides zero tension in the stretch and maximum tension at the top. Unless all you have is a band, I do think dumbbells, cables, or machine laterals would be a better choice. These are going in C tier.
Banded lateral raises, I do agree with Jeffrey here that this exercise is not the best. In my opinion, it's just the crap version of cable lateral raises and dumbbell lateral raises. I really don't understand why you would do this exercise if there are far better alternatives, so I'll have to put this exercise in D tier.
The upright row is definitely an overhated exercise. It's going to target both the upper traps and the side delts with a little bit of biceps involvement. I prefer to do these on cables with a rope because I can sweep the handles out as I row. As long as you have healthy shoulders, there's no evidence that they contribute to shoulder issues. I'm going to put these in B tier.
Upright row, there seems to be some sort of debate if this exercise is bad for your shoulders. Because this exercise looks like the Hawkins-Kennedy test for shoulder impingement, I steer clear of this exercise, but if you're going to do this exercise, don't use a super narrow grip. I personally prefer doing dumbbell high pulls instead of this exercise where my hands lead the way, so I don't get the lethal combo of shoulder elevation and shoulder internal rotation. Another reason why I'm not a big fan of this exercise is that when it comes to pure lateral delt development, I'm always going to go with some sort of lateral raise variation. Some people may think this is pretty harsh, but I'm going to have to put this exercise in F tier.
The reverse pec deck is an amazing rear delt exercise. It provides consistent tension throughout the range of motion, and because your chest is braced, you'll be directing all that tension coming from the stack into your rear delts. I actually prefer to do these sitting sideways because you'll get a much deeper stretch. The downside is that you'll need to do each arm one at a time. That means it'll take a bit longer. You can superset each arm though, so while one side is working, the other side is resting, and you can just go back and forth without much rest in between. My instinct is to put these in A tier, but I think if you can lock in that sideways position, they deserve to be in S tier.
First of all, he's overrating the fuck out of this sideways position. I think S tier for the reverse pec deck is pretty overrated, but this is actually one of the machines I do like. The rear delts are one of the hardest muscles to develop, and it's pretty tough to isolate them. This is why I sometimes like to add in this machine because it does an amazing job isolating the rear delts. Because there are other rear delt exercises that I prefer, I'll put this exercise in B tier.
In S tier. The rope face pull will target the rear delts really well, especially if you set up the rope a little lower, take an underhand grip, and externally rotate your shoulders as you pull, kind of like doing a rear double biceps pose. My minor gripe though is that it's just really hard to get your mid traps to not take over. No matter what cues you use, your mid traps are going to be active. That's not necessarily a bad thing because you do want your mid back to grow as well, but then your rear delts might not be the limiting factor. Still think it's a great exercise to include since it'll give a big stretch on the rear delts, they feel good, and they're solid for overload. Rope face pulls are going in A tier.
I actually really agree with Jeffrey here. Face pulls aren't the best exercise to isolate the rear delts, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's a great exercise. I'm not going to put face pulls in A tier because unlike Jeffrey, I don't just spam A tier, so I'll put face pulls in B tier.
Bent over reverse dumbbell flies have the same problem as dumbbell lateral raises. Zero tension at the bottom when the delts are stretched. I still think they're a good option if you don't have access to cables or if you're really time constrained, and I actually still do them myself when I'm in a hurry. Oddly enough, my rear delts always get really sore from these too. They'd probably be in A tier, but because there's not quite enough tension in the stretch, I've got to knock them back to B tier.
I agree with Jeffrey here. I'll put this exercise in B tier. The resistance profile of this exercise isn't ideal, and unlike the cable variation, I'm unable to pull in the direction of the rear delt fibers. And for this exercise in particular, I find the bent over position to be pretty awkward. But if you don't have access to cables, I can definitely see this exercise having a place in your routine. I definitely find other rear delt exercises to be better, so I'll put this exercise in C tier.
All right, the reverse cable crossover. Amazing stretch on your rear delts, especially if you cross your arms over at the top. Enormous range of motion with nice, even tension throughout the range. As long as you hold the cables themselves and not the handles, it should feel nice and smooth, and you shouldn't run into any clanging as your arms cross over. And then to avoid any left to right muscle imbalances, you can alternate which arm you cross over on top from set to set. As long as you focus on sweeping the cables out rather than yanking them back, you should feel a massive connection with your rear delts. These are amazing, and they're easily going into S tier.
I actually completely agree with Jeffrey here. This has to be the best rear delt exercise in my opinion because the resistance with the cable is amazing. I'm able to pull in the direction of the rear delt fibers, which is diagonally downwards, and I'm able to do this exercise standing up. I'm gonna put this exercise in A tier just because I find the overhead press to be the king of all shoulder exercises, and unlike Jeffrey, I like to keep S tier as an exclusive club. So that's my reaction to Jeffrey Nipples' shoulder exercise tier list. Now that you know a little bit more about shoulder training, you also need to make sure that you develop your biceps and triceps to build aesthetic arms. And I recently made a complete guide on how to develop your biceps and triceps, which you should check out.